In this video, we will quickly talk about the difference between verse and prose, and then between closed form and open form poetry, and then we will talk about how to understand and to write free verse poetry. Let's get started. So, verse and prose. Prose is regular writing with sentences and paragraphs. All your essays, novels, blog posts, and biology textbooks are written in prose. Verse is different than prose. You can usually tell what you're dealing with just by looking at it. This is verse. This is prose. This is verse. This is prose. And again, this is verse. One more time. Here's a passage from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. Can you see where it shifts from verse to prose? Fun fact, about 30% of the Bible is written in verse. Prose always looks like prose, but there are a lot of different ways to look like verse. Let's look at some of these now. One way to talk about different kinds of verse is to put them on a continuum between closed form and open form. Closed form poetry, also known as fixed form poetry, has a lot of structure. And on this end, that's predetermined. The rhyme scheme, the meter, the line length, the stanzaic arrangement are all set by tradition. In the English language, we have a few forms that are fixed or closed. A sonnet is a closed form type of poem. It always has 14 iambic pentameter lines and a rhyme scheme, one of a few predetermined ones. A limerick has 5 anapestic trimeter lines and an AABBA rhyme scheme. And there are other kinds of fixed forms, like the ballad and the villanelle. The structures are what they are and they don't change. So that's the closed end. On the other end, the open form, they don't really have structure, but there's a lot of poems that fall in between these two extremes. As you move out of the fixed forms down the continuum, things loosen up a bit. Poets, rather than being governed by tradition, get to choose the structure of their poems, the rhyme schemes, the line length, and the rhythm. But once they choose them, they usually live within those limits. This famous but often misread poem by Robert Frost is an example. This poem has stanzas. A stanza is a structural unit in poetry, equivalent to a paragraph in prose. They organize and divide a poem into sections, each with its own thematic or structural significance. In this poem, each stanza has 5 lines. It doesn't have to be 5, but within the poem, the stanzas very often have the same number of lines. They also usually have the same pattern of rhyme. These stanzas have an ABAAB pattern. In each stanza, each line will also usually have the same rhythm and meter as the corresponding line in all the other stanzas. As we move down the continuum toward open form, we will find poems that have only a few of these structural elements. Look at this passage from Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. Browning has written this poem in rhyming pairs of lines. That's it. That's all the formal structure there is. And what's more, when you read this poem naturally, you can't even hear the rhymes. Then we get to open form or free verse poetry. It's free of any of the structural restrictions that we've been talking about. This is a free verse poem. You can tell it isn't prose, and you can tell it doesn't have the stanzas in the same length of lines or the rhymes or anything like that. But just because it doesn't have any of these big and obvious structural elements doesn't mean it doesn't have anything going on. It does, and it's pretty cool. First, let's read it. This is To a Daughter Leaving Home by Linda Pastan. When I taught you at 8 to ride a bicycle, loping along beside you, as you wobbled away on 2 round wheels, my own mouth rounding in surprise when you pulled ahead down the curved path of the park, I kept waiting for the thud of your crash as I sprinted to catch up, while you grew smaller, more breakable with distance, pumping for your life, screaming with laughter, the hair flapping behind you like a handkerchief waving goodbye. Reading poetry shouldn't be work. But if you are going to write a poem, that's another story. That's work. So while we look a little bit more closely at this poem, we will try to see some of the work that Linda Pastan has done as she wrote this poem, To a Daughter Leaving Home. Perhaps you noticed the discrepancy between what the title suggests the poem is going to be about and what it is actually about. Why this discrepancy? What does it do? It draws a parallel between the two experiences from the perspective of the mother, the speaker of the poem. So pretty much everything that we think and say about the bike ride in the past is linked somehow to the mother's feelings in the present as her daughter is moving out. Did you notice the punctuation in this poem? Only one period at the very end? What's the deal with that? When you get on a bike and ride down a street, there are no full stops, unless you ride into a tree. The girl's bike ride is a continuous event, so you don't want some period stopping the flow of the movement of the bike ride. So that's a lesson right there. In your writing your own free verse poem, let the punctuation serve your central purpose. Let everything serve your central purpose. The punctuation, or lack thereof, is but one way in which movement is created in this poem. There's also the literal movement. The girl is moving away from the mother on the bike. And did you notice all of those ing verbs? They get more and more frequent as the poem moves along. This gives the impression that the pace of the poem is picking up. How does that relate to how the mother feels? A fourth way movement is created is by sound. Listen to these lines. As you wobbled away on two round wheels, my own mouth rounding. These W sounds combined with the vowels help you to see the wobbling of the bike's front wheel as the daughter gets her balance in the early stages of her bike ride. And lastly, there's the metaphorical movement with the handkerchief waving goodbye. The point of all this movement is to help us to understand just a little of what the mother is experiencing as her daughter moves away from her in the past, and how that feels the same as her movement away from her in the present. Everything works toward this central purpose. If you're not impressed already, let's look at some other parts of this poem. When I taught you at 8 to ride a bicycle, loping along beside you. What is the proximity of the mother to the daughter in the early stages of this poem? She's along and beside. So here's a really important thing you need to know about the lines of free verse poetry. They rarely end with the or and or to. That's because these words don't carry much meaning, and the last word in a line of poetry does. As a reader, you're supposed to notice the last word of each line. So the focal point of this line is the word along. Okay, ready? Here's something else. Another important element to free verse poetry is, in the structuring of the lines, what words get separated and what words come together. Here, along gets separated from beside, but beside comes together with the word you. With this structural move, the poet is really reinforcing the idea that they are together in this. The mother is along for the ride, and with or near her daughter. Beside you, she says. Let's jump down a bit. These lines, in surprise when you pulled ahead down the curved. What is separated and what comes together here? Pulled gets hung out there on the end. The word pulled is a focal point. Why? The mother was with the daughter, but now the daughter is being pulled. She's pulled ahead. When these words, pulled ahead, are together, they can create a sense of anticipation as to what's around the curve. But the poet doesn't want that anticipation. She wants the pulling. So she separates the word pulled from ahead. The next line, path of the park. It has some alliteration in it. Every line in a free verse poem needs to have integrity, an internal consistency, something that holds it together. Whatever it is, it doesn't need to be profound. With this one, it's just held together by sound. A line can also be a unity of meaning, as in the next line, I kept waiting. A line can create an image, like the hair flapping, which comes a little later. A line can be held together by rhythm and repetition, like pumping, pumping. Maybe a line has integrity because it points to a deeper meaning beside you. And the final line in the poem, goodbye. As you write, consider the integrity of each line. Ask yourself, how does it hold together? What does it do? But we are not yet done with this poem. Look at these 3 lines. Sprinted to catch up while you grew smaller, more breakable. These lines are so interesting. I don't think there's even a fancy poetry name for what these lines do. But look at them. The word grew is the focal point for the middle line. The previous line ended with the word up, and the word up hangs out over the word grew. So you can't help but put them together and rewrite the middle line to read, while you grew up. Your eye just goes up there and grabs that up and attaches it. This wouldn't have happened if the word grew wasn't separated from smaller with that line break. But now smaller goes with the word breakable, emphasizing the girl's vulnerability in the eyes of the mother. And this effect wouldn't be possible if breakable wasn't separated from with distance. Cool, eh? But we are not done. Pumping, pumping for your life, screaming with laughter. So lots of action with the ing words. But what happens with the separation of pumping, pumping from for your life screaming? When you're reading this poem, your mind may invert the line to make it make more sense, like screaming for your life. And talk about a second meaning. Okay, what's going on here? Remember, this is all about the mother's experience. The mother fears what lays ahead in the bike ride. It could be dangerous. And the screaming might be how the mother feels about the distance and the dangers. The separation of screaming from the words with laughter do all this work. The daughter sees none of the terrors that worry the mother. She's delighted. The poem ends with a metaphor. Yes, I know, it's a simile. The little girl's hair is blowing in the wind. The mother experiences it like a handkerchief waving goodbye. It's how people used to wave goodbye to their loved ones from the deck of a ship before crossing the ocean to a new continent, probably to never be seen again. And then the last line, goodbye. The word goodbye is the only word in this line. You could say it's both the first word and the last word in this line. Super emphasis here. And the period ends it. It doesn't just end the poem, and it doesn't just end the bike ride. Because of the title, we know it ends the time that the daughter lives at home. It closes a significant chapter of life for both the mother and the daughter. And we know from the poem that the daughter is all excited about it. And now we know how the mother feels about it. I once heard an English teacher tell their students that it's harder to write closed-form poems than open-form poems. I don't know. So, when writing a free verse poem, embrace the freedom, focus on imagery, use strong language, express emotion, consider sound, focus on last words, pay attention to line breaks, check each line for integrity, and edit and revise. All this is to say, make everything serve your central purpose. Everything. Thank you, and happy writing.